Hello everybody and welcome. I'm glad that you can join us. In today's talk and in subsequent talks, I'm going to discuss Buddhism as it is presented in the Pali Tipitaka, the oldest and therefore the most authentic account we have of the Buddha's teachings. And today what I'd like to talk about is a popular subject, the subject of love. And some time ago I gave a talk about the four sublime states, or the four supreme states: love, compassion, sympathetic joy and equanimity. But it's very interesting to note that when Buddhists or Buddhism is being discussed, usually only metta, the highest and most refined form of love, is talked about. But in actual fact, the Buddha talked about quite a wide range, different types of love. And the Buddhists, like the ancient Greeks, had very specific words for different types of love. Whereas generally in English, we have one word for all the different types. But before we talk about love, I'm going to attempt to give a definition of what we mean by that, because the word is used in a very broad sense and a very casual sense. And this is how I'm going to define love. I'm going to say that love is an active interest in, care for, empathy towards, and a desire for intimacy with another or others, usually accompanied by positive feeling. That's going to be my definition of love. That love is an active interest in, care for, empathy towards, and a desire for intimacy with another or others, usually accompanied by positive feeling. So just to iterate a little bit, there's a difference between passive or distant interest in something as opposed to an active interest, which implies actually involving oneself with another person in some way. Care for, that is that there is a desire to nurture or encourage the good in another, to be concerned about their welfare. Empathy means the ability to participate in another person's feelings, so that when they are sad, that we feel their sadness, or when they're joyful and happy, that we feel their joy and their happiness. And a desire for intimacy. So when it comes to love and intimacy, we're usually thinking of sexual intimacy, but there are other types of intimacy as well. Sharing food with another can be a type of empathy. Putting your arm over their shoulder, or giving them a hug, or sharing things that are usually thought of reserved specifically for one individual, sharing or giving that thing with another person. This can be a form of intimacy also. And lastly, that love is usually, but not always, accompanied by positive feeling. So once again, we usually think of love as including a great deal of very, very positive feeling. But this is certainly not always. This is why the Buddha included equanimity, emotional balance, as an aspect of love. And we can think of people like, say, a very, very good and efficient nurse who takes great care and concern for a patient and yet is not emotionally involved, or a doctor may be like that also. So they are expressing a deep love but not necessarily experiencing a positive feeling at the same time. Now, if we look at the Buddha's words in the Pali Tipitaka, we find numerous words for different types of love. I'm just going to mention 10 or 11 of them. Here's some examples. So one would be adara, which is usually used for romantic love. And then we've got attakama, which means something like self-love. sometimes in a negative sense, sometimes in a positive sense. Lokas adara, love of the world. Once again, that may be both positive or negative. Hita, manapa, pema, piya. Sineha. Sineha implies something like oil or something like oil, and it may imply something like two things rubbing together or coming together without friction, non-friction. Sampiya. And then we've got mateya, maternal love, and peteya, paternal love. So, like the ancient Greeks, the ancient Buddhists used different words for specific different types of love. And if we read in the Buddhist scriptures, we find the Buddha talking about at least 10 different types of love, and it's these that I'm going to talk about briefly today. So there would be romantic love, of course, which is the first thing we would think of. Then there would be familial love, that is the love that is characteristic of a successful family. Then there is conjugal love, the love between a husband and wife. Then there is friendship love. Then there is, interesting enough, the love of strangers, or being loving towards strangers. And then self-sacrificing love. We may even talk about forbidden love, a type of love that gets no support or encouragement from those around those who are loving. The love of animals would be another type. And then, of course, there would be the highest love, which is metta. So let's very briefly look at them. Romantic love. So this would be, from a Buddhist perspective, the most basic, but also the least spiritual love. Now, when people fall in love, they often sort of think that there's something mystical going on, you know, I'll love you until the stars fall from the sky, and our meeting was meant to be. Something has gone on in the universe to bring us together. And of course, the people feel like this because this type of love can give an individual probably the most intense positive feeling they ever get. In ordinary life, at least. So the Buddha didn't really have a particularly high opinion of love, because he felt that people lost control of their clear thinking faculties at that time. And of course we generally acknowledge that. How many popular songs do we hear that I'm madly in love with you, or he is madly in love with her, or I lost my mind over her? Yeah, and we say, of course, that love is blind, and in some senses that it is. Familial love, the Buddha has quite a lot to say about that. This is parents' love of their children, of their grandchildren, of all the members of their family. And of course in ancient India you had the extended families, unlike what we have in most Western societies today. The words that the Buddha used here are mateya, which means maternal love, and peteya, paternal love. Some of you may know that in the Dhammapada, the Buddha says love of one's mother and love of one's father is the highest happiness in the world. That's Dhammapada 332. Now, when he said that this is the supreme love in the world, he meant in worldly sense rather than in the spiritual sense. And of course, if somebody has the great blessing to be in a loving family, it is one of the most wonderful experiences that people can have. Then we've got conjugal love, the love between a husband and a wife, or perhaps nowadays between people of the same gender. So this is a type of love which is very important also. Generally speaking, sociologists and psychiatrists and psychologists tend to say that probably the most important thing in an ordinary person's life is being involved in a loving relationship. people who are involved in loving relationships, long-term loving relationships, it seems that they get sick less often, and when they get sick better. They're less likely to abuse drugs and alcohol. They tend to live longer, and so on. So the Buddha would agree that being involved in wholesome, long-term, close and nurturing loving relationships is very, very good for you. And there is a wonderful story in the discourses where a couple who've been married for many years, the husband becomes very critically ill, and throughout his illness his wife looks after him, nurtures him and cares for him, and also reinforces his or encourages him to get better by talking to him about the Dhamma. And when he recovers, he goes to the Buddha and tells him what his wife did throughout his long sickness. And the Buddha said to him, "You have benefited, householder, you have greatly benefited in having your wife full of compassion for you, full of love for you, caring for you, and encouraging and teaching you." And I think that these things would be, from a Buddhist point of view, some of the most important elements in a loving relationship. And in somewhat later, he was talking to this same man and woman, and he said to them that should they, because they have been together so long in this life, should they wish to, they may even be reborn in circumstances in which they come together in the next life, that there's some form of karmic connection between them, some sort of karmic affinity. So it may actually be, according to the Buddha, that people who have very, very close and wholesome relationships might actually be reborn in some sense together in their next life, should they have similar karma. Another type of love that the Buddha talks about is perhaps a little bit unusual. We may not think about it often, but the love of strangers. The Greeks had a word for it, xenia, and in Buddhism the term is sakkara, and it means caring about and giving attention to strangers. So in ancient India, this meant there weren't any hotels. So when a stranger, a traveller or a wayfarer turned up in a town or a village, he had to look for somewhere to stay. And pious people would sometimes give him a room or allow him to stay on their veranda or in their house somewhere and give him food and water until he left the next day. So this hospitality. And this would be an example of where love doesn't necessarily have a positive feeling. And it may have a relevance in modern times too. I notice so often that when I go to a Buddhist society, I notice in Buddhist society, a stranger comes to the Buddhist group and nobody talks to them. Everybody's sitting there with a very serious expression on their face, sort of meditating, and so the newcomer sits there and he doesn't know what's going on and nobody talks to him. They may after the talk. An expression of sakkara, hospitality, kindness and concern and care for strangers would be welcoming the newcomer. And that may be the same in an office or in a neighbourhood when strangers turn up, new people come into the neighbourhood. That would be an example of noticing and showing some concern for the newcomer. Another type of love, perhaps more emphasised in Mahayana than in the early Buddhist tradition, but nonetheless there also would be self-sacrificing love. If we read in the Jatikas, which are a book in the Buddhist scriptures, there are many stories about people who are prepared to undergo considerable difficulties for the sake of others, including trying to save their lives. And those of you who know the Sigalovada Sutta will know that when the Buddha is talking about the best type of friends, he says the highest type of friend is the person who is prepared to endanger his life for the sake of his friend. which is interesting because it mirrors very closely what Jesus said about 500 years later, which is, no greater love have he than he lay down his life for his friend. Then we've got forbidden love. And when I think of forbidden love, I think of in some countries where young people of different religions fall in love with each other, and which creates great hostility in their society or by their parents. Or in countries like India, where young couples of different castes fall in love with each other, and sometimes they're prepared to risk considerable disapproval or even worse because they want to love each other. So there is one case in the Tipitaka the Buddha talks about where a young couple fall in love with each other. Their parents disapprove of it very strongly, and so they form a suicide pact and kill each other. A tragic situation, but one that actually does happen in some countries. So this is a particular type of love where it is so strong that people will behave in ways that are perhaps even in danger or even take their lives. Another type of love which is emphasized very strongly in Buddhism and certainly in Jainism too, and that is the love of animals. Now, you often hear people say that somebody who loves an animal can't do anything wrong, but we know from history and that some people can have very close and loving relationships with an animal and be quite indifferent or cold or even cruel to human beings. It is often, some people find that it is easier for them to love an animal than it is to love a human being. But that, of course, is not always the case. Many people love their dog or their cat or their pet goat. And that love seems to be reciprocated. So that's quite a distinct type of love, but it is a type of love also. And then finally we have the highest type of love that the Buddha talks about, and the relationship, the loving relationship that the Buddha talks about more than any other is friendship love, or the love of a friend, or the love of friends. And I think the reason why the Buddha places so much emphasis on this type of love is that all types of love, conjugal love particularly, but also familial love, that your husband or your wife is also your best friend, that your father or your grandparent is also your best friend. The Buddha talks about several different intensities of friendship love. In the Greeks called it philia, and it's known in Buddhism as mittata, friendship love. So these are just some of the forms of love that the Buddha talks about, and for the most part praises. And I think the reason why he emphasizes this so much is because you might say that all of these types of love are, you might say, they are practice for being able to cultivate and refine the highest type of love, which is metta. That they are a precursor to the higher form of love, love, compassion, sympathetic joy and equanimity, what we call the four divine states, or the four highest states, or the four supreme states. And these are very important for us because they are an essential part of attaining what the Buddha called akuppa ceto vimukti, utter freedom of mind, and that is the aim, that is the goal, that is the culmination.